Chapter 8. The Third Degree. I was hailed from my dungeon by my jailer, accompanied by two figures that looked immensely tall in their black monkish gowns, their heads and faces covered by visor cowls in which two holes were cut for their eyes. Seen by the ruddy glare of the torch which the jailer carried to that subterranean place of darkness, those black, silent figures, their very hands tucked away into the wide-mouthed sleeves of their habits, looked spectral and lurid, horrific messengers of death. By chill, dark passages of stone, through which our steps reverberated, they brought me to a pillared, vaulted underground chamber, lighted by torches and iron brackets on the walls. On a dais stood an oaken writing table bearing two massive wax tapers and a crucifix. At this table sat a portly, swarthy-visaged man in the black robes of the Order of Saint Dominic. Immediately below and flanking him, on either hand, sat two mute-cowled figures to do the office of amanuenses. Away on the right, where the shadows were but faintly penetrated by the rays of the torches, stood an engine with somewhat of the size and appearance of the framework of a couch, but with stout straps of leather to pinion the patient, and enormous wooden screws upon which the frame could be made to lengthen or contract. From the ceiling, gray ropes dangled from pulleys, like the tentacles of some dread monster of cruelty. One glance into that gloomy part of the chamber was enough for me. Repressing a shudder, I faced the Inquisitor, and thereafter kept my eyes upon him to avoid the sight of those other horrors. And he was horror enough for any man in my circumstances to envisage. He was very fat, with a shaven, swarthy face and the dewlap of an ox. In that round fleshliness his eyes were sunken like two black buttons, malicious through their very want of expression. His mouth was loose-lipped and gluttonous and cruel. When he spoke, the deep rumbling quality of his voice was increased by the echoes of that vaulted place. "What is your name?" he said. "I am Agostino d'Anguissola, Lord of Mondolfo, and—" "Pass over your titles," he boomed. "The Holy Office takes no account of worldly rank. What is your age?" "I am in my 21st year." "Benedicamus Dominum," he commented, though I could not grasp the appositeness of the comment. "You stand accused, Agostino d'Anguissola, of sacrilege and of defiling holy things. What have you to say? Do you confess your guilt?" "I am so far from confessing it," I answered, "that I have yet to learn what is the nature of the sacrilege with which I am charged. I am conscious of no such sin. Far from it, indeed." "You shall be informed," he interrupted, imposing silence upon me by a wave of his fat hand, and heaving his vast bulk sideways. "Read him the indictment," he bade one of the amanuenses. From the depths of a visor cowl came a thin, shrill voice. "The Holy Office's knowledge that Agostino d'Anguissola did for a space of some 6 months, during the winter of the year of our blessed Lord 1544, and the spring of the year of our blessed Lord 1545, pursue a fraudulent and sacrilegious traffic, adulterating, for moneys which he extorted from the poor and the faithful, things which are holy, and adapting them to his own base purposes. It is charged against him that in a hermitage on Monte Orsaro, he did claim for an image of Saint Sebastian that it was miraculous, that it had power to heal suffering, and that miraculously it bled from its wounds each year during Passion Week, whence it resulted that pilgrimages were made to this false shrine, and great store of alms was collected by the said Agostino d'Anguissola, which moneys he appropriated to his own purposes. It is further known that ultimately he fled the place, fearing discovery, and that after his flight the image was discovered broken, and the cunning engine by which this diabolical sacrilege was perpetrated was revealed. Throughout the reading, the fleshy eyes of the Inquisitor had been steadily, inscrutably regarding me. He passed a hand over his pendulous chin, as the thin voice faded into silence. "You have heard," said he. "I have heard a tangle of falsehood," answered I. "Never was truth more untruly told than this." The beady eyes vanished behind narrow increases of fat, and yet I knew that they were still regarding me. Presently they appeared again. "Do you deny that the image contained this hideous engine of fraud?" "I do not," I answered. "Set it down." He eagerly bade one of the amanuenses. "He confesses thus much." And then to me, "Do you deny that you occupied that hermitage during the season named?" "I do not." "Set it down," he said again. "What then remains?" he asked me. "It remains that I knew nothing of the fraud. The trickster was a pretended monk, who dwelt there before me, and at whose death I was present. I took his place thereafter, implicitly believing in the miraculous image, refusing, when its fraud was ultimately suggested to me, to credit that any man could have dared so vile and sacrilegious a thing. In the end, when it was broken and its fraud discovered, I quitted that ghastly shrine of Satan's in horror and disgust. There was no emotion on the huge, yellow face. That is the obvious defense, he said slowly. But it does not explain the appropriation of the monies. I appropriated none. I cried angrily. That is the foulest lie of all. Do you deny that alms were made? Certainly they were made, though to what extent I am unaware. A vessel of baked earth stood at the door to receive the offerings of the faithful. It had been my predecessor's practice to distribute a part of these alms among the poor. A part, it was said, he kept to build a bridge over the Bagnanza torrent, which was greatly needed. Well, quoth he, and when you left you took with you the monies that had been collected? I did not, I answered. I gave the matter no thought. When I left I took nothing with me, not so much as a habit I had worn in that hermitage. There was a pause. Then he spoke slowly. Such is not the evidence before the Holy Office. What evidence? I cried, breaking in upon his speech. Where is my accuser? Set me face to face with him. Slowly he shook his huge head with its absurd fringe of greasy locks about the tonsured scalp, that symbol of the crown of thorns. You must surely know that such is not the way of the Holy Office. In its wisdom, this tribunal holds that to produce delators would be to subject them perhaps to molestation, and thus dry up the springs of knowledge and information which it now enjoys. So that your request is idle as is the attempted defense that you have made, the falsehoods with which you have sought to clog the wheels of justice. Falsehood, Sir Monk, quoth I, so fiercely that one of my attendants set a restraining hand upon my arm. The beady eyes vanished and reappeared, and they considered me impassively. Your sin, Agostino d'Anguissola, said he in his booming, level voice, is the most hideous that the wickedness of man could conceive or diabolical greed put into execution. It is a sin that more than any other closes the door to mercy. It is the offense of Simon Mage, and it is to be expiated only through the gates of death. You shall return hence to your cell, and when the door closes upon you, it closes upon you for all time in life, nor shall you ever see your fellow man again. Their hunger and thirst shall be your executioners, slowly to deprive you of a life of which you have not known how to make better use. Without light or food or drink shall you remain there until you die. This is the punishment for such sacrilege as yours. I could not believe it. I stood before him what time he mouthed out those horrible and emotionless words. He paused a moment, and again came that broad gesture of his that stroked mouth and chin. Then he resumed, So much for your body. There remains your soul. In its infinite mercy, the Holy Office desires that your expiation be fulfilled in this life, and that you may be rescued from the fires of everlasting hell. Therefore it urges you to cleanse yourself by a full and contrite avowal ere you go hence. Confess then, my son, and save your soul. Confess? I echoed. Confess to a falsehood? I have told you the truth of this matter. I tell you then, all the world there is none less prone to sacrilege than I, that I am by nature and rearing devout and faithful. These are lies which have been uttered to my hurt. In dooming me you doom an innocent man. Be it so. I do not know that I have found the world so delectable a place as to quit it with any great regret. My blood be upon your own heads and upon this iniquitous and monstrous tribunal. But spare yourselves at least the greater offense of asking my confession of a falsehood. The little eyes had vanished. The face grew very evil, stirred at last into animosity by my denunciation of that court. Then the inscrutable mask slipped once more over that odious countenance. He took up a little mallet and struck a gong that stood beside him. I heard a creaking of hinges and saw an opening in the wall to my right, where I had perceived no door. Two men came forth, brawny, muscular, bearded men in coarse, black hose and leathern waistcoats, cut deep at the neck, and leaving their great arms entirely naked. The foremost carried a thong of leather in his hands. The hoist, said the inquisitor shortly. The men advanced towards me and came to replace the familiars between whom I had been standing. Each seized an arm, and they held me so. I made no resistance. Will you confess? The inquisitor demanded. There is still time to save yourself from torture. But already the torture had commenced, for the very threat of it is known as the first degree. I was in despair. Death I could suffer. But under torments, I feared that my strength might fail. I felt my flesh creeping and tightening upon my body, which had grown very cold with the awful chill of fear. My hair seemed to bristle and stiffen, until I thought that I could feel each separate thread of it. I swear to you that I have spoken the truth. I cried desperately. I swear it by the sacred image of our Redeemer standing there before you. Shall we believe the oath of an unbeliever tainted of sacrilege? He grumbled, and he almost seemed to sneer. Believe or not, I answered, but believe this, that one day you shall stand face to face with a judge whom there is no deceiving, to answer for the abomination that you make of justice in his holy name. Let loose against me your worst cruelties, then they shall be as caresses to the torments that will be loosed against you when your turn for judgment comes. To the hoist with him, he commanded, stretching an arm toward the gray, tentacle-like ropes. We must soften his heart and break the diabolical pride that makes him persevere in blasphemy. They led me aside into that place of torments, and one of them drew down the ropes from the pulley overhead until the ends fell on a level with my wrists. And this was torture of the second degree, to see its imminence. Will you confess? Boomed the Inquisitor's voice. I made him no answer. Strip and attach him, he commanded. The executioners laid hold of me, and in the twinkling of an eye, I stood naked to the waist. I caught my lips and my teeth as the ropes were being adjusted to my wrists, and as thus I suffered torture of the third degree. Will you confess? Came again the question, and scarcely had it been put, for the last time as I well knew, then the door was flung open, and a young man in black sprang into the chamber and ran to thrust a parchment before the Inquisitor. The Inquisitor made a sign to the executioners to await his pleasure. I stood with throbbing pulses and waited, instinctively warned that this concerned me. The Inquisitor took the parchment, considered its seals, and then the writing upon it. That done, he set it down and turned to face us. Release him, he bade the executioners, whereat I felt as I would faint in the intensity of this reaction. When they had done his bidding, the Dominican beckoned me forward. I went, still marveling. See, he said, how inscrutable are the divine ways, and how truth must in the end prevail. Your innocence is established, after all, since the Holy Father himself has seen cause to intervene to save you. You are at liberty. You are free to depart, and to go wheresoever you will. This bowl concerns you. And he held it out to me. My mind moved through these happenings as a man moves through a dense fog, faltering and hesitating at every step. I took the parchment and considered it. Satisfied as to its nature, however mystified as to how the Pope had come to intervene, I folded the document and thrust it into my belt. Then the familiars of the Holy Office assisted me to resume my garments, and all was done now in utter silence, and for my own part in the same mental and dreamlike confusion. At length the Inquisitor waved a huge hand doorwards. "Ait," he said, and added, whilst his raised hand seemed to form a benedictory gesture, "Pax Domini sit tecum, iticum spiritus." I replied mechanically, as, turning, I stumbled out of that dread place in the wake of the messenger who had brought the bull, and who went ahead to guide me. Chapter 9. The Return. Above in the blessed sunlight, which hurt my eyes, for I had not seen it for a full week, I found Gallardo awaiting me in the bare room, and scarcely was I aware of his presence than his great arms went round me and enclasped me so fervently that his corslet almost hurt my breast, and brought back as in a flash a poignant memory of another man fully as tall, who had held me to him one night many years ago, and whose armor, too, had hurt me in that embrace. Then he held me at arm's length and considered me, and his steely eyes were blurred and moist. He muttered something to the familiar, linked his arm through mine, and drew me away, down passages, through doors, and so at last into the busy Roman street. We went in silence by ways that were well known to him, but in which I should assuredly have lost myself. And so we came at last to a fair tavern, the Osteria del Sol, near the Tower of Nona. His horse was stalled here, and a servant led the way above stairs to the room that he had hired. How wrong had I not been, I reflected, to announce before the Inquisition that I should have no regrets in leaving this world. How ungrateful was that speech, considering this faithful one who loved me for my father's sake. And was there not Bianca, who, surely, if her last cry, wrung from her by anguish, contained the truth, must love me for my own? How sweet the revulsion that now came upon me as I sank into a chair by the window and gave myself up to the enjoyment of that truly happy moment in which the gray shadow of death had been lifted from me. Servants bustled in to spread the board with the choice meats that Gelato had ordered and great baskets of luscious fruits and flagons of red Puglia wine, and soon we seated ourselves at the feast. But ere I began to eat, I asked Gelato how this miracle had been wrought. What magic powers he wielded that even a holy office must open its doors at his bidding. With a glance at the servants who attended us, he bade me eat, saying that we should talk anon. And as my reaction had brought a sharp hunger in its train, I fell to with the best will in all the world, and from broth to figs there were few words between us. At last, our goblets charged and the servants withdrawn, I repeated my inquiry. "The magic is not mine," said Gelato. "It is Cavalcanti's. It was he who obtained this bull." And with that he set himself briefly to relate the matters that already are contained here concerning that transaction, but the minuter details of which I was later to extract from Falcone. And as he proceeded with his narrative, I felt myself growing cold again with apprehension, just as I had grown cold that morning in the hands of the executioners. Until at last, seeing me dead white, Gelato checked to inquire what ailed me. What was the price that Cavalcanti paid for this? I inquired in answer. I could not glean it, nor did I stay to insist, for there was haste. He assured me that the thing had been accomplished without hurt to his honor, life, or liberty, and with that I was content and spurred for Rome. And you have never since thought what the price was that Cavalcanti might have paid? He looked at me with troubled eyes. I confess that in this matter the satisfaction of coming to your salvation has made me selfish. I have had thoughts for nothing else. I groaned and flung out my arms across the table. He has paid such a price, I said, that 1,000 times sooner would I that you had left me where I was. He leaned forward, frowning darkly. What do you mean? He cried. And then I told him what I feared. Told him how Farnese had sued for Bianca's hand for Cosimo, how proudly and finally Cavalcanti had refused, how the Duke had insisted that he would remain at Pagliano until my lord changed his mind, how I had learned from Juliana the horrible motive that urged the Duke to press for that marriage. Lastly, and that is the price he consented to pay, I cried wildly. His daughter, that sweet virgin, was the price, and at this hour, maybe, the price is paid and that detestable bargain consummated. Oh, Gelato, why was I not left to rot in that dungeon of the Inquisition, since I could have died happily, knowing naught of this? By the blood of God, boy, do you imply that I had knowledge? Do you suggest that I would have bought any life at such a price? No, I answered. I know that you did not, that you could not. And then I leaped to my feet. And we sit talking here whilst this, oh, God, I sobbed. We may yet be in time. To horse, then. Let us away. He, too, came to his feet. Aye, you are right. It but remains to remedy the evil. Come, then, anger shall mend my spent strength. It can be done in 3 days. We will ride as none ever rode yet since the world began. And we did so desperately that by the morning of the 3rd day, which was a Sunday, we were in Forli, having crossed the Apennines at Arcangelo, and by that same evening in Bologna. We had not slept, and we had scarcely rested since leaving Rome. We were almost dead from weariness. Since such was my own case, what must have been Galeotto's? He was of iron, it is true, but consider that he had ridden this way at as desperate a pace already, to save me from the clutches of the Inquisition, and that, scarce rested, he was riding north again. Consider this, and you will not marvel that his weariness conquered him at last. At the inn at Bologna, where we dismounted, we found old Falcone awaiting us. He had set out with his master to ride to Rome, but being himself saddle-worn at the time, he had been unable to proceed farther than this. And here Galeotto in his fearsome patience had left him, pursuing his way alone. Here, then, we found the equerry again, consumed by anxiety. He leapt forward to greet me, addressing me by the old title of Madonnino, which I loved to hear from him, however much that title might otherwise arouse harsh and gloomy memories. Here at Bologna, Galeotto announced that he would be forced to rest, and we slept for 3 hours, until night had closed in. We were shaken out of our slumbers by the host, as he had been ordered. But even then I lay entranced, my limbs refusing their office, until the memory of what was at issue acted like a spur upon me, and caused me to fling my weariness aside as if it had been a cloak. Gelato, however, was in a deplorable case. He could not move a limb. He was exhausted, utterly and hopelessly exhausted with fatigue, and want to sleep. Falco and I pulled him to his feet between us, but he collapsed again, unable to stand. "I am spent," he muttered. "Give me 12 hours. 12 hours sleep, Agostino, and I'll ride with you to the devil." I groaned and cursed in one. 12 hours. I cried, and she, "I can't wait, Gelato. I must ride on alone." He lay on his back and stared up at me, and his eyes had a glassy stare. Then he roused himself by an effort and raised himself upon his elbow. "That is it. Boy, ride on alone. Take Falcone. Listen, there are 70 men of mine at Pagliano who will follow you to hell at a word that Falcone shall speak to them from me. About it, then, and save her. But wait, boy, do no violence to Farnese, if you can help it. But if I can't, I asked, if you can't, no matter, but endeavor not to offer him any hurt. Leave that to me, anon when all is ripe for it. Today it would be premature, and we should be crushed by his speech trailed off into incoherent mutterings. His eyelids dropped, and he was fast asleep again. 10 minutes later we were riding north again, and all that night we rode, along the endless Emilian way, pausing for no more than a draught of wine from time to time, and munching a loaf as we rode. We crossed the Po and kept steadily on, taking fresh horses when we could, until toward sunset a turn in the road brought Pagliano into our view, gray and lichened on the crest of its smooth emerald hill. The dusk was falling and lights began to gleam from some of the castle windows when we brought up in the shadow of the gateway. A man-at-arms lounged out of the guardhouse to inquire our business. "Is Madonna Bianca wed yet?" was the breathless greeting I gave him. He peered at me, and then at Falcone, and he swore in some surprise. "Well, return my lord. Madonna Bianca? The nuptials were celebrated today. The bride has gone." "Gone?" I roared. "Gone whither, man?" "Why?" "To Piacenza, to my Lord Cosimo's palace there. They set out some 3 hours since." "Where is your lord?" I asked him, flinging myself from the saddle. "Within doors, most noble. How I found him, or by what ways I went to do so, are things that are effaced completely from my memory. But I know that I came upon him in the library. He was sitting hunched in a great chair, his face ashen, his eyes fevered. At sight of me, the cause, however innocent, of all this evil, his brows grew dark and his eyes angry. If he had reproaches for me, I gave him no time to utter them, but hurled him mine. "What have you done, sir?" I demanded. "By what right did you do this thing? By what right did you make a sacrifice of that sweet dove? Did you conceive me so vile as to think that I should ever owe you gratitude, that I should ever do aught but abhor the deed, abhor all who had a hand in it, abhor the very life itself purchased from me at such a cost?" He cowered before my furious wrath, for I must have seemed terrific as I stood thundering there, my face wild, my eyes bloodshot, half mad from pain and rage and sleeplessness. "And do you know what you've done?" I went on. "Do you know to what you have sold her? Must I tell you?" And I told him, in a dozen brutal words that brought him to his feet, the lion in him roused at last, his eyes ablaze. "We must after them," I urged. "We must wrest her from these beasts, and make a widow of her for the purpose. Galeotto's lances are below, and they will follow me. You may bring what more you please. Come, sir, to horse." He sprang forward with no answer beyond a muttered prayer that we might come in time. "We must," I answered fiercely, and ran madly from the room, along the gallery and down the stairs, shouting and raging like a maniac, Cavalcanti following me. Within 10 minutes, Galeotto's 70 men, and another score of those who garrisoned Pagliano, for Cavalcanti, were in the saddle and galloping hell for leather to Piacenza. Ahead on fresh horses went Falcone and I, the lord of Pagliano spurring beside me and pestering me with questions as to the source of my knowledge. Our great fear was lest we should find the gates of Piacenza closed on our arrival. But we covered the 10 miles in something under an hour, and the head of our little column was already through the Podesta gate when the first hour of night rang out from the Duomo, giving the signal for the closing of the gates. The officer in charge turned out to view so numerous a company and challenged us to stand. But I flung him the answer that we were the black bands of Ser Gelato and that we rode by order of the Duke, with which perforce he had be content. For we did not stay for more and were too numerous to be detained by such meager force as he commanded. Up the dark street we swept, the same street down which I had last ridden on that night, when Gambara had opened the gates of the prison for me. And so we came to the square and to Cosimo's palace. All was in darkness, and the great doors were closed. A strange appearance this for a house to which a bride had so newly come. I dismounted as lightly as if I had not ridden lately more than just 10 miles from Pagliano. Indeed, I had become unconscious of all fatigue, entirely oblivious of the fact that for 3 nights now I had not slept, save for 3 hours at Bologna. I knocked briskly on the iron-studded gates. We stood there waiting, Cavalcante and Falco on afoot with me, the men on horseback still, a silent phalanx. I issued an order to Falcone, 10 of them to secure our egress, the rest to remain here and allow none to leave the house. The equerry stepped back to convey the command it is turned to men, and the 10 he summoned slipped instantly from their saddles and ranged themselves in the shadow of the wall. I knocked again, more imperatively, and at last the post in the door was opened by an elderly serving man. "What's this?" he asked, and thrust a lantern into my face. "We seek Messer Cosimo d'Anguissola," I answered. He looked beyond me at the troop that lined the street, and his face became troubled. "Why, what is amiss?" quoth he. "Fool, I shall tell that to your master. Conduct me to him. The matter presses." "Nay, then, but have you not heard? My lord was wed today. You would not have my lord disturbed at such a time." He seemed to leer. I put my foot into his stomach and bore him backward, flinging him full length upon the ground. He went over and rolled away into a corner where he lay bellowing. "Silence him," I bade the men who followed us in. "Then, half of you remain here to guard the stairs. The rest attend us." The house was vast, and it remained silent, so that it did not seem that the clown's scream when he went over had been heard by any. Up the broad staircase we sped, guided by the light of the lantern, which Falcone had picked up, for the place was ominously in darkness. Cavalcante kept pace with me, panting with rage and anxiety. At the head of the stairs we came upon a man whom I recognized for one of the Duke's gentlemen in waiting. He had been attracted, no doubt, by the sound of our approach, but at sight of us he turned to escape. Cavalcante reached forward in time to take him by the ankle, so that he came down heavily upon his face. In an instant I was sitting upon him, my dagger at his throat. "A sound," said I, "and you shall finish it in hell." Eyes bulging with fear stared at me out his white face. He was an effeminate cur, of the sort that the Duke was wont to keep about him, and at once I saw that we should have no trouble with him. Whereas Cosimo, I asked him shortly, "Come, man, conduct us to the room that holds him if you would by your dirty life." "He is not here," wailed the fellow. "You lie, you hound," said Cavalcante, and turned to me. "Finish him, Agostino." He bade me. The man under me writhed, filled now by the terror that Cavalcante had so cunningly known how to inspire in him. "I swear to God that he is not here," he answered, and but that fear had robbed him of his voice, he would have screamed it. "Gesù, I swear it is true." I looked up at Cavalcante, baffled and sick with sudden dismay. I saw Cavalcante's eye, which had grown dull, kindle anew. He stooped over the prostrate man. "Is the bride here? Is my daughter in this house?" The fellow whimpered and did not answer until my dagger's edge was at his throat again. Then he suddenly screeched, "Yes." In an instant I had dragged him to his feet again, his pretty clothes and daintily curled hair all crumpled, so that he looked the most pitiful thing in all the world. "Lead us to her chamber," I bade him, and he obeyed as men obey when the fear of death is upon them. Chapter 10. The Nuptials of Bianca. An awful thought was in my mind as we went, evoked by the presence in such a place of one of the Duke's gentlemen. An awful question rose again and again to my lips, and yet I could not bring myself to utter it. So we went on in utter silence now, my hand upon his shoulder, clutching velvet doublet and flesh and bone beneath it, my dagger bare in my other hand. We crossed an antechamber whose heavy carpet muffled our footsteps, and we halted before tapestry curtains that masked the door here, curbing my fierce impatience. I paused. I signed to the 5 attendant soldiers to come no farther. Then I consigned the courtier who had guided us to the care of Falcone, and I restrained Cavalcanti, who was shaking from head to foot. I raised a heavy, muffling curtain, and standing there an instant by the door, I heard my Bianca's voice, and her words seemed to freeze the very marrow in my bones. "Oh, my lord," she was imploring in a choking voice. "Oh, my lord, have pity on me." "Sweet," came the answer, "it is I who beseech pity at your hands. Do you not see how I suffer? Do you not see how fiercely love of you is torturing me? How I burn, that you can so cruelly deny me?" It was Farnese's voice. Cosimo, that dastard, had indeed carried out the horrible compact of which Juliana had warned me, carried it out in a more horrible and inhuman manner than even she had suggested or suspected. Cavalcanti would have hurled himself against the door, but that I set a hand upon his arm to restrain him, and a finger in my other hand, the one that held the dagger, to my lips. Softly I tried the latch. I was amazed to find the door yield. And yet, where was the need to lock it? What interruption could have feared in a house that evidently had been delivered over to him by the bridegroom, a house that was in the hands of his own people? Very quietly I thrust the door open, and we stood there upon the threshold, Cavalcanti and I, father and lover of that sweet maid who was the prey of this foul duke. We stood whilst a man might count a dozen, silent witnesses of that loathsome scene. The bridal chamber was all hung in golden arras, save the great carved bed which was draped in dead white velvet and ivory damask, symbolizing the purity of the sweet victim to be offered up upon that sacrificial altar. And to that dread sacrifice she had come, for my sake, as I was to learn, with the fearful willingness of Iphigenia. For that sacrifice she had been prepared, but not for this horror that was thrust upon her now. She crouched upon a tall-backed praying stool, her gown not more white than her face, her little hands convulsively clasped to make her prayer to that monster who stood over her, his mottled face all flushed, his eyes glowing as they considered her helplessness and terror with horrible, pitiless greed. Thus we observed them, ourselves unperceived for some moments, for the praying stool on which she crouched was placed to the left, by the cowled fireplace, in which a fire scented what was crackling, the scene lighted by 2 golden candle branches that stood upon the table near the curtained window. "Oh, my lord," she cried in her despair, "of your mercy leave me, and no man shall ever know that you sought me thus. I will be silent, my lord. Oh, if you have no pity for me, have, at least, pity for yourself. Do not cover yourself with the infamy of such a deed that will make you hateful to all men. Gladly at such a price would I purchase your love. My Bianca, what pains could daunt me? Ah, you are mine, you are mine." As the hawk that has been long poised closes its wings and drops at last upon its prey, so swooped he of a sudden down upon her, caught and dragged her up from the praying stool to crush her to him. She screamed in that embrace and sought to battle, swinging round so that her back was fully towards us, and Farnese, swinging round also in that struggle, faced us and beheld us. It was as if a mask had been abruptly plucked from his face. So sudden and stupendous was its alteration. From flush that had been it grew livid and sickly. The unholy fires were spent in his eyes, and they grew dull and dead as a snake's. His jaw was loosened, and the sensual mouth looked unutterably foolish. For a moment I think I smiled upon him, and then Cavalcanti and I sprang forward, both together. As we moved, his arms loosened their hold, and Bianca would have fallen, but that I caught her, her terror still upon her. She glanced upwards to see what fresh enemy was this, and then at sight of my face, as my arms closed about her and held her safe, "Agostino!" she cried, and closed her eyes to lie panting on my breast. The Duke, fleeing like a scared rat before the anger of Cavalcanti, scuttled down the room to a small door in the wall that held the fireplace. He tore it open and sprang through, Cavalcanti following recklessly. There was a snarl and a cry, and the Lord of Pagliano staggered back, clutching one hand his breast, and through his fingers came an ooze of blood. Falcone ran to him, but Cavalcanti swore like a man possessed. "It is nothing," he snapped. "By the horns of Satan, it is nothing. Of flesh wound, and like a fool I gave back before it. After him. In there. Kill, kill." Out came Falcone, sword with a swish, and into the dark closet beyond went the equerry with a roar, Cavalcanti after him. It seemed that scarce had Farnese got within that closet then, flattening himself against the wall. He had struck at Cavalcanti as the latter followed, thus driving him back and gaining all the respite he needed, for now they found the closet empty. There was a door beyond that opened to a corridor, and this was locked. Not a doubt, but that Farnese had gone that way. They broke that door down. I heard them at what time I comforted Bianca and soothed her, stroking her head, her cheek, and murmuring fondly to her, until presently she was weeping softly. Thus Cavalcanti and Falcone found us presently when they returned. Farnese had escaped with one of his gentlemen, who had reached him in time to warn him that the street was full of soldiers and the palace itself invaded. Thereupon the Duke had dropped from one of the windows to the garden, his gentleman with him, and Cavalcanti had been no more than in time to see them disappearing through the garden gate. The lord of Pagliano's buff coat was covered with blood where Pierluigi had stabbed him, but he would give the matter no thought. He was like a tiger now. He dashed out into the antechamber, and I heard him bellowing orders. Someone screamed horribly, and then followed a fierce din, as if the very place were coming down about our ears. "What is it?" cried Bianca, quivering in my arms. Are they fighting?" "I do not think so, sweet," I answered her. "We are in great strength. Have no fear." And then Falcone came in again. "The Lord of Pagliano is raging like a madman," he said. "We had best be getting away, or we shall have a brush with the captain of justice." Supporting Bianca, I led her from that chamber. "Where are we going?" she asked me. "Home to Pagliano." I answered her, and with that answer comforted that sorely tried maid. We found the antechamber in wreckage. The great chandelier had been dragged from the ceiling. Pictures were slashed and cut to ribbons. The arras had been torn from the walls, and the costly furniture was reduced to firewood. The double windows opening to balconies stood wide, and not a pane of glass left whole, the fragments lying all about the place. Thus, it seemed, childishly almost, had Cavalcanti vented his terrible rage, and I could well conceive what would have befallen any of the Duke's people upon whom in that hour he had chanced. I did not know then that the poor pimp who had acted as our guide was hanging from the balcony dead, nor that it had been the horrible scream I had heard. On the stairs we met the raging Cavalcanti reascending, the stump of his shivered sword in his hand. "Hasten," he cried. "I was coming for you. Let us begone." Below, just within the main doors, we found a pile of furniture set on a heap of straw. "What is this?" I asked. "You shall see," he roared. "Get to horse." I hesitated a moment, then obeyed him, and took Bianca on the withers in front of me, my arm about her to support her. Then he called to one of the men-at-arms, who stood by with a flaring torch. He snatched the brand from his hand, and stabbed the straw with it in a dozen places, from each of which there leapt at once a tongue of flame. When at last he flung the torch in the heart of the pile, it was all a roaring, hissing, crackling blaze. He stood back and laughed. "If there are any more of his brothel mates in the house, they can escape as he did. They will be more fortunate than that one." And he pointed up to the limp figure hanging from the balcony, so that I now learnt what already I have told you. With my hand I screened Bianca's eyes. "Do not look," I bade her. I shuddered at the sight of that limply hanging body. And yet I reflected that it was just. Any man who could have lent his aid to the foul crime that was attempted there that night deserved his fate and worse. Cavalcanti got a horse, and we rode down the street, bringing folk to their windows in alarm. Behind us the flames began to lick out from the ground floor of Cosimo's palace. We reached the Porta Podesta, and peremptorily bade the guard open for us. He answered, as became his duty, with the very words that had been addressed to me at that place on a night 2 years ago. "None passes out tonight." In an instant a group of our men surrounded him. Others made a living barrier before the guardhouse, whilst 2 or 3 dismounted, drew the bolts, and dragged the great gates open. We rode on, crossing the river, and heading straight for Pagliano. For a while it was the sweetest ride that ever I rode, with my Bianca nestling against my breast, and responding faintly to all the foolishness that poured from me in that ambrosial hour. And then it seemed to me that we rode not by night, but in the blazing light of day, along a dusty road, flanking an arid, sun-drenched stretch of the Campagna. And despite the aridity, there must be water somewhere, for I heard it thundering as the Bagnanza had thundered after rain, and yet I knew that could not be the Bagnanza. for the Bagnanza was nowhere in the neighborhood of Rome. Suddenly a great voice, and I knew it for the voice of Bianca, called me by name. Agostino. The vision was dissipated. It was night again, and we were riding for Pagliano through the fertile lands of Oltrapa, and there was Bianca clutching at my breast and uttering my name in accents of fear, whilst the company about me was halting. "What is it?" cried Cavalcante. "Are you hurt?" I understood. I had been dozing in the saddle, and I must have rolled out of it, but that Bianca awakened me with her cry. I said so. "Body of Satan," he swore, "to doze at such a time. I have scarce been out of the saddle for 3 days and 3 nights. This is the 4th. I informed him I have had but 3 hours' sleep since we left Rome. I am done. I admitted, "You, sir, had best take your daughter. She is no longer safe with me." It was so. The fierce tension which had banished sleep from me whilst these things were doing, being now relaxed, left me exhausted as Gallardo had been at Bologna, and Gallardo had urged me to halt and rest there. He had begged for 12 hours. I could now thank heaven from a full heart for having given me the strength and resolution to ride on, for those 12 hours would have made all the difference between heaven and hell. Cavalcante himself would not take her, confessing to some weakness. For all that he insisted that his wound was not serious, yet he had lost much blood through having neglected in his rage to stanch it. So it was to Falcone that fell the charge of that sweet burden. The last thing I remember was Cavalcante's laugh, as, from a high ground we had mounted, he stopped to survey a ruddy glare above the city of Piacenza, where, in a vomit of sparks, Cosimo's fine palace was being consumed. Then we rode down into the valley again, and as we went, the thud of hooves grew more and more distant, and I slept in the saddle as I rode, a man-at-arms on either side of me, so that I remember no more the doings of that strenuous night. Chapter 11. The Penance. I awakened in the chamber that had been mine at Pagliano before my arrest by order of the Holy Office, and I was told upon awakening that I had slept a night and a day, and that it was eventide once more. I rose, bathed, and put on a robe of furs, and then Gallardo came to visit me. He had arrived at dawn, and he too had slept for some 10 hours since his arrival. Yet despite of it, his air was haggard, his glance overcast and heavy. I greeted him joyously, conscious that we had done well, but he remained gloomy and unresponsive. "There's ill news," he said at last. "Cavalcante is in a raging fever, and he is sapped of strength, his body almost drained of blood. I even fear that he is poisoned, that Farnese's dagger was laden with some venom. Oh, surely it will be well with him." I faltered. He shook his head somberly, his brows furrowed. He must have been stark mad last night, to have raged as he did with such a wound upon him, and to have ridden 10 miles afterwards. Oh, it was midsummer frenzy that sustained him. Here in the courtyard, he reeled unconscious from the saddle. They found him drenched with blood from head to foot, and he has been unconscious ever since. I am afraid, he shrugged despondently. "Do you mean that he may die?" I ask scarce above a whisper. It will be a miracle if he does not, and that is one more crime to the score of Pierluigi. He said it in a tone of indescribable passion, shaking his clenched fist at the ceiling. The miracle did not come to pass. 2 days later, in the presence of Gallardo, Bianca, Fra Gervasio, who had been summoned from his Piacenza convent to shrive the unfortunate baron, and myself, Ettore Cavalcante sank quietly to rest. Whether he was dealt an envenomed wound, as Gallardo swore, or whether he died as a result of the awful draining of his veins, I do not know. At the end, he had a moment of lucidity. "You will guard my Bianca, Agostino," he said to me, and I swore it fervently, as he bade me, whilst upon her knees beyond the bed, clasping one of his hands that had grown white as marble, Bianca was sobbing broken-heartedly. Then the dying man turned his head to Gallardo. "You will see justice done upon that monster ere you die," he said. "It is God's holy work." And then his mind became clouded again by the mist of approaching dissolution, and he sank into a sleep from which he never awakened. We buried him on the morrow in the chapel of Pagliano, and on the next day Gallardo drew up a memorial wherein he set forth all the circumstances of the affair in which that gallant gentleman had met his end. It was a terrible indictment of Pierluigi Farnese. Of this memorial he prepared 2 copies, and to these, as witnesses of all the facts therein related, Bianca, Falcone, and I appended our signatures, and Fra Gervasio added his own. One of these copies Galato dispatched to the Pope, the other to Ferrante Gonzaga in Milan, were requests that it should be submitted to the Emperor. When the memorial was signed, he rose, and taking Bianca's hand in his own, he swore by his every hope of salvation that ere another year was sped her father should be avenged together with all the other of Pier Luigi's victims. That same day he set out again upon a conspirator's work, whose aim was not only the life of Pier Luigi, but the entire shattering of the pontifical sway in Parma and Piacenza. Some days later he sent me another score of lances, for he kept his forces scattered about the country, whilst gradually he increased their numbers. Thereafter we waited for events at Pagliano, the drawbridge raised, and none entering save after due challenge. We expected an attack which never came, for Pier Luigi did not dare to lead an army against an imperial fief upon such hopeless grounds as were his own. Possibly, too, Galeotto's memorial may have caused the Pope to impose restraint upon his dissolute son. Cosimo d'Anguissola, however, had the effrontery to send a messenger a week later to Pagliano to demand the surrender of his wife, saying that she was as by God's law and man's, and threatening to enforce his rights by an appeal to the Vatican. That we sent the messenger empty-handed away, it is scarce necessary to chronicle. I was in command at Pagliano, holding it in Bianca's name, as Bianca's lieutenant and castellan, and I made oath that I would never lower the bridge to admit an enemy. But Cosimo's message aroused in us a memory that had lain dormant these days. She was no longer for my wooing. She was the wife of another. It came to us almost as a flash of lightning in the night, and it startled us by all that it revealed. "The fault of it is all mine," said she, as we sat that evening in the gold and purple dining room where we had supped. It was with those words that she broke the silence that had endured throughout the repast, until the departure of the pages and the seneschal who had ministered to us precisely as in the days when Cavalcante had been alive. "Ah, not that, sweet," I implored her, reaching a hand to her across the table. "But it is true, my dear," she answered, covering my hand with her own. "If I had shown you more mercy when so contritely you confess your sin, mercy would have been shown to me. I should have known from the sign I had that we were destined for each other, that nothing that you had done could alter that. I did know it, and yet," she halted there, her lip tremulous, "and yet you did the only thing that you could do when your sweet purity was outraged by the knowledge of what I really had been. But you were so no more," she said with something of pleading in her voice. "It was you, the blessed sight of you, that cleansed me." I cried. When love awoke in me, I knew love for the first time, for that other thing which I deemed love had none of love's holiness. Your image drove out all the sin from my soul. The peace which half a year of penance, of fasting and flagellation could not bring me, was brought me by my love for you when it awoke. It was as a purifying fire that turned to ashes all the evil desires that my heart had held. Her hand pressed mine. She was weeping softly. "I was an outcast," I continued. "I was a mariner without compass, far from the sight of land, striving to find my way by the light of sentiments implanted in me from early youth. I sought salvation desperately, sought it in a hermitage, as I would have sought it in a cloister, but that I had come to regard myself as unworthy of the cloister life. I found it at last in you, in the blessed contemplation of you. It was you who taught me the lesson that the world is God's world, and that God is in the world as much as in the cloister. Such was the burden of your message that night, when you appeared to me on Monte or Sorrow." "Oh, Agostino," she cried, "and all this being so, can you refrain from blaming me for what has come to pass? If I had but had faith in you, the faith in the sign which we both received, I should have known all this, known that if you had sinned you had been tempted, and that you had atoned. I think the atonement lies here and now, in this," I answered very gravely. "She was the wife of another who dragged me down. You are the wife of another who have lifted me up. She through sin was attainable. That you can never, never be, else should I have done with life in earnest. But do not blame yourself, sweet saint. You did as your pure spirit bade you. Soon all would have been well, but that already Messer Pier Luigi had seen you." She shuddered. "You know, dear, that if I submitted to wed your cousin, it was to save you, that such was the price imposed." "Dear saint," I cried, "I but mention it that upon such a score you may have no doubt of my motives." "How could I doubt?" I protested. I rose, and moved down the room toward the window, behind which the night gleamed deepest blue. I looked out upon the gardens from which the black shadows of stark poplars thrust upward against the sky, and I thought out this thing. Then I turned to her, having, as I imagined, found the only and rather obvious solution. There is but one thing to do, Bianca. And that? Her eyes were very anxious, and looked perhaps even more so in consequence of the pallor of her face and the lines of pain that come into it in these weeks of such sore trial. I must remove the barrier that stands between us. I must seek out Cosimo and kill him. I said it without anger, without heat of any sort, a calm, cold statement of a step that it was necessary to take. It was a just measure, the only measure that could mend an unjust situation. And so I think she too viewed it, for she did not start or cry out in horror or manifest the slightest surprise at my proposal. But she shook her head and smiled very wistfully. "What a folly would not that be?" she said. "How would it amend what is? You would be taken, and justice would be done upon you summarily. Would that make it any easier or any better for me? I should be alone in the world and entirely undefended." "Ah, but you go too fast," I cried. "By justice I cannot suffer. I need but to state the case, the motive of my quarrel, the iniquitous wrong that was attempted against you, the odious traffic of this marriage, and all men would applaud my act. None would dare do me a hurt." "You are too generous in your faith in man," she said. "Who would believe your claims?" "The courts," I said, "the courts of a state in which Pierluigi governs? But I have witnesses of the facts. Those witnesses would never be allowed to testify. Your protests would be smothered. And how would your case really look?" she cried. "The world would conceive that the lover of Bianca de Cavalcante had killed her husband that he might take her for his own. What could you hope for against such a charge as that? Men might even remember that other affair for Fanny's, and even the populace, which may be said to have saved you erstwhile, might veer round and change in the opinion which it has ever held. They would say that one who has done such a thing once may do it twice. That, oh, for pity's sake, stop. Have mercy." I cried, flinging out my arms towards her, and mercifully she ceased, perceiving that she had said enough. I turned to the window again and pressed my brow against the cool glass. She was right. That acute mind of hers had pierced straight to the very core of this matter. To do the thing that had been in my mind would be not only to destroy myself, but to defile her, for upon her would recoil a portion of the odium that must be flung at me. And, as she said, what then must be her position? They would even have a case upon which to drag her from these walls of Pagliano. She would be a victim of the civil courts. She might, at Pierluigi's instigation, be proceeded against as my accomplice in what would be accounted a dastardly murder for the basis of motives. I turned to her again. "You are right," I said. "I see that you are right. Just as I was right when I said that my atonement lies here and now. The penance for which I cried out so long is imposed at last. It is as just as it is cruelly apartment." I came slowly back to the table and stood facing her across it, she looking up at me with very piteous eyes. "Bianca, I must go hence," I said. "That, too, is clear." Her lips parted, her eyes dilated, her face, if anything, grew paler. "Oh, no, no," she cried piteously. "It must be," I said. "How can I remain? Cosimo may appeal for justice against me, claiming that I hold his wife in duress, and justice will be done. But can you not resist? Pagliano is strong and well-manned. The black bands are very faithful men, and they will stand by you to the end. And the world," I cried, "what will the world say of you? It is you yourself have made me see it. Shall your name be dragged in the foul mire of scandal? The wife of Cosimo d'Anguissola, a runagate with her husband's cousin? Shall the world say that?" She moaned and covered her face with her hands. Then she controlled herself again and looked at me almost fiercely. "Do you care so much for what men say?" "I am thinking of you." "Then think of me to better purpose, my Agostino. Consider that we are confronted by two evils, and that the choice of the lesser is forced upon us. If you go, I am all unprotected, and the harm is done already." Long I looked at her with such a yearning to take her in my arms and comfort her, and I had the knowledge that if I remained, daily must I experience this yearning which must daily grow crueler and more fierce from the very restraint I must impose upon it. And then that rearing of mine, all drenched in sanctity misunderstood, came to my help and made me see in this an added burden to my penance, a burden which I must accept if I would win the ultimate grace. And so I consented to remain, and I parted from her with no more than a kiss bestowed upon her fingertips, and went to pray for patience and strength to bear my heavy cross, and so win to my ultimate reward, be it in this world or the next. In the morning came news by a messenger from Galato, news of one more foul crime that the Duke had committed on that awful night, when we had rescued Bianca from his evil claws. The unfortunate Juliana had been found dead in her bed upon the following morning, and the popular voice said that the Duke had strangled her. Of that rumor I subsequently had confirmation. It would appear that, maddened with rage at the loss of his prey, that ravening wolf had looked about to discover who might betray his purpose and procured that intervention. He bethought him of Juliana. Had not Cosimo seen her in intimate talk with me on the morning of my arrest, and would he not have reported it to his master? So to the handsome mansion in which he housed her, and to which at all hours he had access, the Duke went instantly. He must have taxed her with it. And knowing her nature, I can imagine that she not only admitted that his thwarting was due to her, but admitted it mockingly, exultingly, jeering as only a jealous woman can jeer, until his rage he seized her by the throat. How bitterly must she not have repented that she had not kept a better guard upon her tongue, during those moments of her agony, brief in themselves, yet horribly long to her, until her poor wanton spirit went forth from the weak clay that she had loved too well. When I heard the end of that unfortunate, all my bitterness against her went out of me, and in my heart I set myself to find excuses for her. Witty and cultured in much else she had been as stupid as a dumb beast. She was a religious, as were many, because what she saw of religion did not inspire respect in her, and whilst one of her lovers had been a prince of the church, another had been the son of the Pope. She was by nature sensuous, and her sensuousness stifled in her all perception of right or wrong. I like to think that her death was brought about as a result of a good deed. So easily might it have been the consequence of an evil one, and I trust that that deed, good in itself, whatever the sources from which it may have sprung, may have counted in her favor and weighed in the balance against the sins that were largely of her nature. I bethought me of Fra Gervasio's words to me, who that knows all that goes to the making of sin shall ever dare to blame a sinner? He had applied those words to my own case where Juliana was concerned. But do they not apply equally to Juliana? Do they not apply to every sinner when all is said? Chapter 12. Blood. The words that passed between Bianca and me that evening in the dining room express all that could be said of our attitude to each other during the months that followed. Daily we met, and the things which our lips no longer dared to utter, our eyes expressed. Days passed and grew to weeks, and these accumulated into months. The autumn faded from gold to gray, and the winter came and laid the earth to sleep, and then followed spring to awaken it once more. None troubled us at Pagliano, and we began with some justice to consider ourselves secure. Galeotto's memorial, not a doubt, had stirred up matters, and Pier Luigi would be under orders from his father not to add one more scandal to the menu of his life by venturing to disturb Madonna Bianca in her stronghold at Pagliano. From time to time we were visited by Galeotto. It was well for him that fatigue had overwhelmed him that day at Bologna, and so hindered him from taking a hand with us in the doings of that hideous night. Else he might no longer have freedom to roam the state unchallenged as he did. He told us of the new citadel the Duke was building in Piacenza, and how for the purpose he was pulling down houses relentlessly to obtain material and to clear himself a space, and how, further, he was widening and strengthening the walls of the city. But I doubt, he said one morning in that spring, if he will live to see the work completed, for we are resolved at last. There is no need for an armed rising. 50 of my lances will be all that is necessary. We are planning a surprise, and Ferrante Gonzaga is to be at hand to support us with imperial troops and to receive the state as the emperor's vicegerent when the hour strikes. It will strike soon, he added, and this, too, shall be paid for the rest. And he touched the black morning gown that Bianca wore. He rode away again that day, and he went north for a last interview with the emperor's lieutenant, but promising to return before the blow was struck to give me the opportunity to bear my share in it. Spring turned to summer, and we waited, wandering in the gardens together, reading together, playing at bowls or tennis, though the latter game was not considered one for women, and sometimes exercise in the men-at-arms in the great inner bailey where they lodged. Twice we rode out a hawking, accompanied by a strong escort, and returned without mishap, though I would not consent to a third excursion, lest a rumor having gone abroad, our enemies should lie in wait to trap us. I grew strangely fearful of losing her who did not, and who never might belong to me, and all this time my penance, as I regarded it, grew daily heavier to bear. Long since I had ceased so much as to kiss her fingertips, but to kiss the very air she breathed was fraught with danger to my peace of mind. And then one evening, as we paced the garden together, I had a moment's madness, a moment in which my yearnings would no longer be repressed. Without warning, I swung about, caught her in my arms, and crushed her to me. I saw the sudden flicker of her eyelids, the one swift upward glance of her blue eyes, and I beheld in them a yearning akin to my own, but also a something of fear that gave me pause. I put her from me. I knelt and kissed the hem of her mourning gown. "Forgive me, sweet," I besought her very humbly. "My poor Agostino," was all she answered me, what time her fingers fluttered gently over my sable hair. Thereafter I shunned her for a whole week, and was never in her company save at meals under the eyes of our attendants. At last, one day in the early part of September, on the very anniversary of her father's death, the 8th of that month it was, and a Thursday, came Galato a considerable company of men-at-arms. And that night he was gay and blithe as I had never seen him in these 12 months past. When we were alone, the cause of it, which already I suspected, at last transpired. "It is the hour," he said very pregnantly. "His sands are swiftly running out. Tomorrow, Agostino, you ride with me to Piacenza. Falcone shall remain here to captain the men in case any attempt should be made upon Pagliano, which is not likely. And now," he told us of the gay doings there had been in Piacenza for the occasion of the visit of the Duke's son Ottavio, that same son-in-law of the emperor whom the latter befriended, yet not to the extent of giving him the duchy in his father's place, when that father should have gone to answer for his sins. Daily there had been justin tournaments and all manner gaieties, for which the Piacentini had been sweated until they could sweat no more. Having fawned upon the people that they might help him to crush the barons, Farnese was now crushing the people whose service he no longer needed. Extortion had reduced them to poverty and despair, and their very houses were being pulled down to supply material for the new citadel, the Duke recking little who might thus be left without a roof over his head. "He has gone mad," said Galato, and laughed. "Pierluigi could not more effectively have played his part, so as to serve our ends. The nobles he alienated long ago, and now the very populace is incensed against him and weary of his rapine. It is so bad with him that of late he has remained shut in the citadel, and seldom ventures abroad, so as to avoid the sight of the starving faces of the poor and the general ruin that he is making of that fair city. He has given out that he is ill. A little bloodletting will cure all his ills forever." Upon the morrow Galato picked 30 of his men, and gave them their orders. They were to depose their black liveries, and clad as country folk, but armed as country folk would be for a long journey. They were severally to repair afoot to Piacenza, and assemble there upon the morning of Saturday at the time and place he indicated. They went, and that afternoon we followed. "You will come back to me, Agostino?" Bianca said to me at parting. "I will come back," I answered, and bowing I left her, my heart very heavy. But as we rode, the prospect of the thing to do warmed me a little, and I shook off my melancholy. Optimism colored the world for me all of the rosy hue of promise. We slept in Piacenza that night, in a big house in the street that leads to the church of San Lazzaro, and there was a company of perhaps a dozen assembled there, the principals being the brothers Pallavicini of Cortomaggiore, who had been among the first to feel the iron hand of Pierluigi. There were also present Agostino Landi and the head of the house of Confalinieri. We sat after supper about a long table of smooth brown oak, which reflected as in a pool the beakers and flagons with which it was charged, when suddenly Galato spun a coin upon the middle of it. It fell flat presently, showing the ducal arms and the inscription of which the abbreviation plaque was a part. Galato set his finger to it. "A year ago I warned him," said he, "that his fate was written there in that shortened word. Tomorrow I shall read the riddle for him." I did not understand the allusion, and said so. "Why," he explained, not only to me but to others whose brows had also been knit, "first plaque stands for Placentia, where he will meet his doom, and then it contains the initials of the 4 chief movers in this undertaking, Pallavicini, Landi, Anguissola, and Confalinieri. You force the omen to come true when you give me a leader's rank in this affair, said I. He smiled but did not answer, and returned the coin to his pocket. And now the happening that is to be related is to be found elsewhere, for it is a matter which many men have written in different ways, according to their feelings or to the hand that hired them to the writing. Soon after dawn, Galato quitted us, each of us instructed how to act. Later in the morning, as I was on my way to the castle, where we were to assemble at noon, I saw Galato riding through the streets at the Duke's side. He had been beyond the gates with Pier Luigi on an inspection of the new fortress that was building. It appeared that once more there was talk between the Duke and Galato, the latter's taking service under him, and Galato made use of this circumstance to forward his plans. He was, I think, the most self-contained and patient man that it would have been possible to find for such an undertaking. In addition to the condottiero, a couple of gentlemen on horseback attended the Duke, and half a score of Swiss lanzknecht in gleaming corselets and steel morions, shouldering their formidable pikes, when afoot to hedge his excellency. The people fell back before that little company. The citizens doffed their caps with the respect that is begotten of fear, but their air was sullen, and in the main they were silent, though here and there some knave, with the craven adulation of those born to serve at all costs, raised a feeble shout of duca. The Duke moved slowly at little more than a walking pace, for he was all crippled again by the disease that ravaged him, and his face, handsome in itself, was now repulsive to behold. It was a livid background for fiery pustules that mottled it, and under the sunken eyes there were great brown stains of suffering. I flattened myself against the wall in the shadow of a doorway, lest he should see me, for my height made me an easy mark in that crowd. But he looked neither to right nor to left as he rode. Indeed, it was said that he could no longer bear to meet the glances of the people he had so grossly abused and outraged with deeds that are elsewhere abundantly related, and with which I need not turn your stomachs here. When they had gone by, I followed slowly in their wake towards the castle. As I turned out a fine road that Gambara had built, I was joined by the brothers Pallavicini, a pair of resolute, grizzled gentlemen, the elder of whom, as you will remember, was slightly lame. With an odd sense of fitness, they had dressed themselves in black. They were accompanied by half a dozen of Galeotto's men, but these bore no device by which they could be identified. We exchanged greetings and stepped out together across the open space of the Piazza della Cittadella towards the fortress. We crossed the drawbridge and entered unchallenged by the guard. People were wont to come and go, and to approach the Duke it was necessary to pass the guard in the antechamber above, whose business it was to question all comers. Moreover, the only guards had consisted of a couple of Swiss who lounged in the gateway, the garrison being all at dinner, a circumstance upon which Galato had calculated in appointing noon as the hour for the striking of the blow. We crossed the quadrangle, and passing under a second archway came into the inner bailey as we had been bidden. Here we were met by Confalinieri, who also had half a dozen men with him. He greeted us and issued his orders sharply. You, Ser Agostino, are to come with us, whilst you others are to remain here until Messer Landi arrives with the remainder of our forces. He should have a score of men with him, and they will cut down the guard when they enter. The moment that is done, let a pistol shot be discharged as the signal to us above, and proceed immediately to take up the bridge and overpower the Swiss who should still be at table. Landi has his orders and knows how to act. The Pallavicini briefly spoke their assents, and Confalinieri, taking me by the arm, led me quickly above stairs, his half-dozen men following close upon our heels. Upon none was there any sign of armor, but every man wore a shirt of mail under his doublet or jerkin. We entered the antechamber, a fine, lofty apartment, richly hung and richly furnished. It was empty of courtiers, for all were gone to dine with the captain of the guard, who had been married upon that very morning, and was giving a banquet in honor of the event, as Galato had informed himself when he appointed the day. Over by a window sat 4 of the Swiss, the entire guard, about a table playing at dice, their lances deposited in an angle of the wall. Watching their game, for which he had lingered after accompanying the Duke thus far, stood the tall, broad-shouldered figure of Galato. He turned as we entered, and gave us an indifferent glance as if we were of no interest to him, then returned his attention to the dicers. 1 or 2 of the Swiss looked up at us casually. The dice rattled merrily, and there came from the players little splutters of laughter and deep guttural German odes. At the room's far end, by the curtains that masked the door of the chamber where Farnese sat at dinner, stood an usher in black velvet, staff in hand, who took no more interest in us than did the Swiss. We sauntered over to the dicer's table, and in placing ourselves the better to watch their game, we so contrived that we entirely hemmed them into the embrasure, whilst Confalonieri himself stood with his back to the pikes, an effective barrier between the men and their weapons. We remained thus for some moments whilst the game went on, and we laughed at the winners and swore at the losers, as if our hearts were entirely in the dicing, and we had not another thought in the world. Suddenly a pistol shot crackled below, and startled the Swiss, who looked at one another. One burly fellow, whom they named Hubley, held the dice box poised for a throw that was never made. Across the courtyard below, men were running with drawn swords, shouting as they ran, and hurled themselves through a doorway leading to the quarters where the Swiss were at table. This the guard saw through the open window, and they stared, muttering German oaths to express their deep bewilderment. And then there came a creak of winches and a grinding of chains to inform us that the bridge was being taken up. At last those four Landsknechts looked at us. "Beim Blutgott," swore Hubley, "was GDS." Our set faces, showing no faintest trace of surprise, quickened their alarm, and this became flavored by suspicion when they perceived at last how closely we pressed about them. "Continue your game," said Confalonieri quietly. "It will be best for you." The great blond fellow Hubley flung down the dice box and heaved himself up truculently to face the speaker, who stood between him and the lances. Instantly Confalonieri stabbed him, and he sank back into his chair with a cry, intense of surprise in his blue eyes. So sudden and unlooked for had the action been. Galato had already left the group about the table, and with a blow of his great hand, he felled the usher who sought to bar his passage to the Duke's chamber. He tore down the curtains, and he was wrapping and entangling the fellow in the folds of them when I came to his aid, followed by Confalonieri, whose 6 men remained to hold the 3 sound, and the 1 wounded Swiss in check. And now from below there rose such a din of steel on steel, of shouts and screams and curses, that it behoved us to make haste. Bidding us follow him, Galato flung open the door. At table sat Farnese with 2 of his gentlemen, one of whom was the Marquis Sforza, the other a doctor canon law named Coppollati. Alarm was already written on their faces. At sight of Galato, "Ah, you are still here," cried Farnese. "What is taking place below? Have the Swiss fallen to fighting among themselves?" Galato returned no answer, but advanced slowly into the room. And now Farnese's eyes went past him and fastened upon me, and I saw them suddenly dilate. Beyond me, they went and met the cold glance of Confalonieri, that other gentleman he had so grievously wronged and whom he had stripped of the last rag of his possessions and his rights. The sun, coming to the window, caught the steel that Confalonieri still carried in his hands. Its glint drew the eyes of the Duke, and he must have seen that the Baron's sleeve was bloody. He rose, leaning heavily upon the table. "What does this mean?" he demanded in a quavering voice, and his face had turned gray with apprehension. "It means," Galato answered him, firmly and coldly, "that your rule in Piacenza is at an end, that the pontifical sway is broken in these states, and that beyond the Ferrante Gonzaga waits with an army to take possession here in the Emperor's name. Finally, my Lord Duke, it means that the devil's patience is to be rewarded, and that he is at last to have you so faithfully serve him upon earth." Farnese made a gurgling sound and put a jeweled hand to his throat as if he choked. He was all in green velvet, and every button of his doublet was a brilliant of price, and that gay raiment by its incongruity seemed to heighten the tragedy of the moment. Of his gentleman, the doctor sat frozen with terror in his high-backed seat, clutching the arms of it, so that his knuckles showed white as marble. In like case were the 2 attendant servants, who hung motionless by the buffet. But Sforza, a man of some spirit for all his effeminate appearance, leapt to his feet and set a hand to his weapons. Instantly Confalonieri's sword flashed from its sheath. He had passed his dagger into his left hand. "On your life, my Lord Marquis, do not meddle here," he warned him in a voice that was like a trumpet call. And before that ferocious aspect and those naked weapons Sforza stood checked and intimidated. I too had drawn my poniard, determined that Farnese should fall to my steel in settlement of the score that lay between us. He saw the act, and if possible his fears were increased, for he knew that the wrongs he had done me were personal matters between us for which it was not likely I should prove forgiving. "Mercy!" he gasped, and held out supplicating hands to Galato. "Mercy!" I echoed and laughed fiercely. "What mercy would you have shown me against whom you set the holy office, but that you could sell my life at a price that was merciless? What mercy would you have shown to the daughter of Cavalcani when she lay in your foul power? What mercy did you show her father, who died by your hand? What mercy did you show the unfortunate Juliana, whom you strangled in her bed? What mercy did you ever show to any that you dare ask now for mercy?" He looked at me with dazed eyes, and from me to Galato. He shuddered and turned a greenish hue. His knees were loosened by terror, and he sank back into the chair from which he had risen. At least, he gasped, "let me have a priest to shrive me. Do not let me die with all my sins upon me." In that moment there came from the antechamber the sound of swiftly moving feet, and the clash of steel mingling with cries. The sound heartened him. He conceived that someone came to his assistance. He raised his voice in a desperate screech. To me, help!" As he shouted, I sprang towards him, to find my passage suddenly barred by Galeotto's arm. He shot out, and my breast came against it as against a rod of iron. It threw me out of balance, and ere I had recovered it had thrust me back again. "Back there," said Galeotto's brazen voice. "This affair is mine. Mine are the older wrongs and the greater." With that he stepped behind the Duke's chair, and Farnese, in a fresh spur of panic, came to his feet. Galato locked an arm about his neck and pulled his head back. Into his ear he muttered words that I could not overhear, but it was matter that stilled Farnese's last struggle. Only the Duke's eyes moved, rolling in his head as he sought to look upon the face of the man who spoke to him, and in that moment Galato wrenched his victim's head still farther back, laying entirely bare the long brown throat, across which he swiftly drew his dagger. Coppola screamed and covered his face with his hands. Sforza Fabiani, white to the lips, looked on like a man entranced. There was a screech from Farnese that ended in a gurgle, and suddenly the blood spurted from his neck as from a fountain. Galato let him go. He dropped to his chair and fell forward against the table, drenching it in blood. Thence he went over sideways and toppled the floor, where he lay twitching, a huddle of arms and legs, the head lolling sideways, the eyes vitreous, and blood all about him. Chapter 13. The overthrow, the sight, turned me almost physically sick. I faced about and sprang from the room out into the antechamber, where a battle was in progress. Some 3 or 4 of the Duke's gentlemen and a couple of Swiss had come to attempt a rescue. They had compelled Galeotto's 6 men to draw and defend themselves, the odds being suddenly all against them. Into that medley I went with drawn sword, hacking and cutting madly, giving knocks and taking them, glad of the excitement of it, glad of anything that would shut out from my mind the horror of the scene I had witnessed. Presently Confalonieri came out to take a hand, leaving Galato on guard within, and in a few minutes we had made an end of that resistance, the last splutter of resistance within those walls. Beyond some cuts and scratches that some of us had taken, not a man of ours was missing, whilst of the Duke's followers not a single one remained alive in that antechamber. The place was a shambles. Hangings that had been clutched had been torn from the walls. A great mirror was cracked from top to bottom. Tables were overset and wrecked. Chairs were splintered, and hardly a pane of glass remained in any of the windows. And everywhere there was blood, everywhere dead men. Up the stairs came trooping now our assembled forces, led by Landi and the Pallavicini. Below, all was quiet. The Swiss garrison, taken by surprise at table, as was planned, had been disarmed, and all were safe and impotent under lock and bolt. The guards at the gate had been cut down, and we were entirely masters of the place. Sforza Fagliani, Coppola, and the 2 servants were fetched from the Duke's chamber and taken away to be locked up in another room until the business should be ended. For after all, it was but begun. In the town the alarm bell was ringing from the tower of the communal palace, and at the sound I saw Galeotto's eyes kindling. He took command, none disputing it him, and under his orders men went briskly to turn the cannon of the fortress upon the square, that an attack might be repulsed if it were attempted. And 3 salvos were fired, to notify Ferrante Gonzaga, where he waited that the castle was in the hands of conspirators and Pier Luigi slain. Meanwhile, we had returned with Gelato to the room where the Duke had died, and where his body still lay, huddled as it had fallen. The windows of this chamber were set in the outer wall of the fortress, immediately above the gates and commanding a view of the square. We were 6: Confalinieri, Landi, the 2 Pallavicini, Gelato, and myself, besides a slight fellow named Malvicini, who had been officer light horse in the Duke's service, but who had taken a hand in betraying him. In the square there was by now a seething, excited mob to which a little army of perhaps 1,000 men of the town militia with their captain, de Terni, riding at their head, was forcing its way, and they were shouting Duca and crying out that the castle had been seized by Spaniards, by which they meant the emperor's troops. Gelato dragged a chair to the window, and standing upon it, showed himself to the people. "Disperse," he shouted to them, "to your homes. The Duke is dead." But his voice could not surmount that raging din, above which continued to ring the cry of Duca. "Duca." "Let me show them their Duca," said a voice. It was Malvicini's. He had torn down a curtain rope, and had attached an end of it to one of the dead man's legs. Thus he dragged the body forward toward the window. The other end of the rope he now knotted very firmly to a mullion. Then he took the body up in his arms, whilst Gelato stood aside to make way for him, and staggering under his ghastly burden, Malvicini reached the window and heaved it over the sill. It fell the length of the rope, and there was arrested with a jerk to hang head downwards, spread eagle against the brown wall, and the diamond buttons in his green velvet doublet sparkled merrily in the sunshine. At that sight a great silence swept across the multitude, and availing himself of this, Gelato again addressed those Piacentini. "To your homes," he cried to them, "and arm yourself to defend the state from your enemies if the need should arise. There hangs the Duke dead. He has been slain to liberate our country from unjust oppression." Still, it seemed, they did not hear him, for though to us they appeared to be almost silent, yet there was a rustle and stir amongst them, which must have deafened each to what was being announced. They renewed their cries of Duca of Spaniards, and arms. "A curse on your Spaniards," cried Malvicini. "Here, take your Duke. Look at him and understand." And he slashed the rope across, so that the body plunged down into the castle ditch. A few of the foremost of the crowd ran forward and scrambled down into the ditch to view the body, and from them the rumor of the truth ran like a ripple over water through that mob, so that in the twinkling of an eye there was no man in that vast concourse, and all Piacenza seemed by now to be packed into the square, but knew that Pier Luigi Farnese was dead. A sudden hush fell. There were no more cries of Duca. They stood silent, and not a doubt but that in the breast of the majority surged a great relief. Even the militia ceased to advance. If the Duke was dead, there was nothing left to do. Again Gelato spoke to them, and this time his words were caught by those in the ditch immediately below us, and from them they were passed on, and suddenly a great cry went up, a shout of relief, a paean of joy. If Farnese was dead, and well dead, they could, at last, express the thing that was in their hearts. And now at the far end of the square a glint of armor appeared. A troop of horse emerged, and began slowly to press forward through the crowd, driving it back on either side, but very gently. They came 3 abreast, and there were 60 of them, and from their lance heads fluttered bannerols, showing a sable bar on an argent field. They were Galeotto's free company, headed by one of his lieutenants. Beyond, they too had been awaiting the salvo of artillery that should be their signal to advance. When their identity was understood, and when the crowd had perceived that they rode to support the holders of the castle, they were greeted with lusty cheers, in which presently even the militia joined, for these last were Piacentini, and no Swiss hireling soldiers of the Duke's. The drawbridge was let down, and the company thundered over to draw up in the courtyard under the eyes of Gelato. He issued his orders once more to his companions, then calling for horses for himself and for me, and bidding a score of lances to detach themselves to ride with us, we quitted the fortress. We pressed through the clamant multitude until we had reached the middle of the square. Here Gelato drew rein and, raising his hand for silence, informed the people once more that the Duke had been done to death by the nobles of Piacenza, thus to avenge alike their own and the people's wrongs, and to free them from unjust oppression and tyranny. They cheered him when he had done, and the cry now was Piacenza, Piacenza. When they had fallen silent again, "I would have you remember," he cried, that Pierluigi was a pontiff's son, and that the pontiff would make haste to avenge his death and to reestablish here in Piacenza the Farnese sway, so that all that we have done this day may go for naught unless we take our measures. The silence deepened. But you have been served by men who have the interest of the state at heart, and more has been done to serve you than the mere slaying of Pierluigi Farnese. Our plans are made, and we but wait to know is it your will that the state should incorporate itself as of old with that of Milan, and place itself under protection of the emperor, who will appoint you fellow countrymen for rulers, and will govern you wisely and justly, abolishing extortion and oppression. A thunder of assent was his answer. Cesare! Cesare! Was now the cry, and caps were tossed into the air. Then go arm yourselves and repair to the commune, and there make known your will to the Anzianian councillors, and see that it is given effect by them. The emperor's lieutenant is at your gates. I ride to surrender to him the city in your name, and before nightfall he will be here to protect you from any onslaught of the pontificals. With that he pushed on, the mob streaming along with us, intent upon going there and then to do the thing that Galeotto advised. And by now they had discovered Galeotto's name, and they were shouting it in acclamation of him. And at the sound he smiled, though his eyes seemed very wistful. He leaned over to me and gripped my hand where it lay on the saddle-bow clutching the reins. Thus is Giovanni d'Anguissa at last avenged, he said to me in a deep voice that thrilled me. I would that he were here to know, I answered. And again Galeotto's eyes grew wistful as they looked at me. We went out of town at last. And when we came to high ground beyond the river, we saw on a plain below phalanx upon phalanx of a great army. It was Ferrante Gonzaga's imperial force. Galeotto pointed to it. That is my goal, he said. You had best ride on to Pagliano with these lances. You may need them there. I had hoped that Cosimo would have been found in the castle with Pierluigi. His absence makes me uneasy. Away with you, then. You shall have news of me within 3 days. We embraced, on horseback as we were. Then he wheeled his charger and went down the steep ground, riding hard for Ferrante's army, whilst we pursued our way, and came some 2 hours later, without mishap, to Pagliano. I found Bianca awaiting me in the gallery above the courtyard, drawn thither by the sounds of our approach. Dear Agostino, I have been so fearful for you, was her greeting when I had leapt up the staircase to take her hand. I led her to the marble seat she had occupied on that night, 2 years ago, when first we had spoken of our visions. Briefly, I gave her the news of what had befallen in Piacenza. When I had done, she sighed and looked at me. It brings us no nearer to each other, she said. Nay, now, this much nearer, at least, that the imperial decree will return me the lordships of Mondolfo and Carmina, dispossessing the usurper. Thus I shall have something to offer you, my Bianca. She smiled at me very sadly, almost reproachfully. Foolish, said she. What matter the possessions that it may be yours to cast into my lap? Is that what we wait for, Agostino? Is there not Pagliano for you? Would not that, at need, be lordship enough? The meanest cottage of the countryside were lordship enough so that you shared it. I answered passionately, as many in like case have answered before and since. You see, then, that you are wrong to attach importance to so slight a thing as this imperial decree where you and I are concerned. Can an imperial decree annul my marriage? For that a papal bull would be necessary. And how is a papal bull to be obtained? It is not for us, I admitted miserably. I have been wicked, she said, her eyes upon the ground, a faint color stirring in her cheeks. I have prayed that the usurper might be dispossessed of his rights in me. I have prayed that when the attack was made and revolt was carried into the citadel of Piacenza, Cosimo d'Anguissa might stand at his usual post beside the Duke and might fall with him. Surely justice demanded it, she cried out. God's justice as well as man's. His act in marrying me was a defilement of one of the holiest of sacraments, and for that he should surely be punished and struck down. I went upon my knees to her. Dear love, I cried, see, I have you daily in my sight. Let me not be ungrateful for so much. She took my face in her hands and looked into my eyes, saying no word. Then she leaned forward and very gently touched my forehead with her lips. God pity us a little, Agostino, she murmured, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The fault is mine, all mine. I denounce myself. We are being visited with my sins. When I can take you for my own, if that blessed day should ever dawn, I shall know that I have attained a pardon, that I am cleansed and worthy of you at last. She rose, and I escorted her within, then went to my own chamber to bathe and rest. Chapter 14. The Citation. We were breaking our fast upon the following morning, when Falcon sent word to me by one of the pages that a considerable force was advancing towards us from the south. I rose, somewhat uneasy, yet I reflected that it was possible that news of the revolt in Piacenza having reached Parma, this was an army of pontificals moving thence upon the rebellious city. But in that case, what should they be doing this side of Pa? An hour later, from the battlements where we paced side by side, Bianca and I, we were able to estimate this force, and we fixed its strength at 50 lances. Soon we could make out the device upon their banneroles. A boar's head azure upon an argent field, my own device, that of the Anguilla Mondolfo, and instantly I knew them for Cosimo's men. On the lower parapet 6 culverins had been dragged into position under the supervision of Falcone, who was still with us at Pagliano. These pieces stood loaded and manned by the soldiers to whom I had assigned the office of engineers. Thus we waited until the little army came to a halt about a quarter of a mile away, and a trumpeter with a flag of truce rode forward accompanied by a knight armed capapi, his beaver down. The herald wounded challenge. It was answered from the postern by a man-at-arms, whereupon the herald delivered his message. In the name of our Holy Father and Lord, Paul III, we summon Agostino d'Anguilla here to confer with the high and mighty Cosimo d'Anguilla, tyrant of Mondolfo and Carmina. 3 minutes later, to their infinite surprise, the bridge thudded down to span the ditch, and I walked out upon it with Bianca at my side. Will the Lord Cosimo come within to deliver his message? I demanded. The Lord Cosimo would not, fearing a trap. Will he meet us here upon the bridge, divesting himself first of his weapons? Myself, I am unarmed. The herald conveyed the words to Cosimo, who hesitated still. Indeed, he had wheeled his horse when the bridge fell, ready to gallop off at the first sign of sortie. I laughed. You are a paltry coward. Cosimo, when all is said, I shouted. Do you not see that had I planned to take you, I need resort to no subterfuge? I have, I added, though untruthfully, twice your number of lances under arms, and by now I could have flung them across the bridge and taken you under the very eyes of your own men. You were rash to venture, so far. But if you will not venture farther, at least send me your herald. At that he got down from his horse, delivered up sword and dagger to his single attendant, received from the man a parchment, and came towards us, opening his visor as he advanced. Midway upon the bridge we met, his lips curled in a smile of scorn. Greetings, my Strolling Saint, he said. Through all your vagaries you are at least consistent in that you ever engage your neighbor's wife to bear you company in your wanderings. I went hot and cold, red and white by turns. With difficulty I controlled myself under that taunt. The cruelest he could have flung at me in Bianca's hearing. Your business here? I snarled. He held out the parchment, his eyes watching me intently, so that they never once strayed to Bianca. Read, St. Mountebank. He bade me. I took the paper, but before I lowered my eyes to it, I gave him warning. If on your part you attempt the slightest treachery, I said, you shall be repaid in kind. My men are at the winches, and they have my orders that at the first treacherous movement on your part they are to take up the bridge. You will see that you could not reach the end of it in time to save yourself. It was his turn to change color under the shadow of his beaver. Have you trapped me? He asked between his teeth. If you had anything of the Anguilla besides a name, I answered, you would know me incapable of such a thing. It is because I know that of the Anguilla you have nothing but the name, that you are a craven, a dastard and a dog, that I have taken my precautions. Is it your conception of valor to insult a man whom you hold as if bound hand and foot against striking you as you deserve? I smiled sweetly into that white, scowling face. Throw down your gauntlet upon this bridge, Cosimo, if you deem yourself affronted, if you think that I have lied, and most joyfully will I take it up and give you the trial by battle of your seeking. For an instant, I almost thought that he would take me at my word, as most fervently I hoped, but he restrained himself. Read, he bade me again with a fierce gesture. and accounting him well worn by now, I read with confidence. It was a papal brief ordering me under pain of excommunication and death to make surrender to Cosimo d'Anguilla of the castle of Pagliano, which I traitorously held, and of the person of his wife, Madonna Bianca. This document is not exact, said I. I do not hold this castle traitorously. It is an imperial fief, and I hold in the emperor's name. He smiled. Persist if you are weary of life, he said. Surrender now, and you are free to depart and go wheresoever you list. Continue in your offense, and the consequences shall daunt you ere all is done. This imperial fief belongs to me, and it is for me, who am Lord Pagliano by virtue of my marriage and the late lord's death, to hold it for the emperor. And you are not to doubt that when this brief is laid before the emperor's lieutenant at Milan, he will move instantly against you to cast you out and to invest me in those rights which are mine by God's law and man's alike. My answer may, at first, have seemed hardly to the point. I held out the brief to him. To seek the emperor's lieutenant, you need not go as far as Milan. You will find him in Piacenza. He looked at me, as if he did not understand. How? He asked. I explained. While you have been cooling your heels in the antechambers of the Vatican to obtain this endorsement of your infamy, the world hereabouts has moved a little. Yesterday, Ferrante Gonzaga took possession of Piacenza in the emperor's name. Today, the council will be swearing fealty to Caesar upon his lieutenant's hands. He stared at me for a long moment, speechless in his utter amazement. Then he swallowed hard. And the Duke, he asked. The Duke has been in hell these 24 hours. Dead? He questioned, his voice hushed. Dead, said I. He leaned against the rail of the bridge, his arms fallen limply to his sides, one hand crushing the pontifical parchment. Then he braced himself again. He had reviewed the situation, and did not see that it hurt his position when all was said. Even so, he urged, what can you hope for? The emperor himself must bow before this, and do me justice. And he smacked the document. I demand my wife, and my demand is backed by pontifical authority. You are mad if you think that Charles V can fail to support it. It is possible that Charles V may take a different view of the memorial setting forth the circumstances of your marriage from that which the Holy Father appears to have taken. I counsel you to seek the imperial lieutenant at Piacenza without delay. Here you waste time. His lips closed with a snap. Then, at last, his eyes wandered to Bianca, who stood just beside and slightly behind me. Let me appeal to you, Monna Bianca, he began, but at that I got between them. Are you so dead to shame, I roared, that you dare address her, you pimp, you jackal, you eater of dirt? Be off, or I will have this drawbridge raised and deal with you here and now, in despite of Pope and Emperor and all the other powers you can invoke. Away with you then. You shall pay, he snarled. By God, you shall pay. And on that he went off, in some fear lest I should put my threat into execution. But Bianca was in a panic. He will do as he says, she cried as soon as we had re-entered the courtyard. The emperor cannot deny him justice. He must. Oh, Agostino, it is the end. And see to what a pass I have brought you. I comforted her. I spoke brave words. I swore to hold that castle, as long as one stone of it stood upon another. But deep down in my heart, there was naught but presages of evil. On the following day, which was Sunday, we had peace. But towards noon on Monday, the blow fell. An imperial herald from Piacenza rode out to Pagliano with a small escort. We were in the garden when word was brought us, and I bade the herald be admitted. Then I looked at Bianca. She was trembling and had turned very white. We spoke no word whilst they brought the messenger, a brisk fellow in his black and yellow Austrian livery. He delivered me a sealed letter. It proved to be a summons from Ferrante Gonzaga to appear upon the morrow before the imperial court, which would sit in the communal palace of Piacenza, to deliver judgment upon an indictment laid against me by Cosimo d'Anguilla. I looked at the herald, hesitation in my mind and glance. He held out a second letter. This, my lord, I was asked by favor to deliver to you also. I took it and considered the superscription. These to the most noble Agostino d'Anguilla at Pagliano. The hand was Galeotto's. I tore it open. It contained but 2 lines. Upon your life, do not fail to obey the imperial summons. Send Falcone to me here at once. and it was signed, Galliado. It is well, I said to the herald. I will not fail to attend. I bade the seneschal, who stood in attendance, to give the messenger refreshment ere he left, and upon that dismissed him. When we were alone, I turned to Bianca. Galliado bids me go. I said, there is surely hope. She took the note, and passing a hand over her eyes, as if to clear away some mist that obscured her vision, she read it. Then she considered the curt summons that gave no clue, and lastly looked at me. It is the end, I said. One way or the other, it is the end. But for Galliado's letter, I think I should have refused to obey, and made myself an outlaw indeed. As it is, there is surely hope. Oh, Agostino, surely, surely, she cried. Have we not suffered enough? Have we not paid enough already for the happiness that should be ours? Tomorrow I shall go with you to Piacenza. No, no, I implored her. Could I remain here? She pleaded. Could I sit here and wait? Could you be so cruel as to doom me to such a torture of suspense? But if the worst befalls? It cannot, she answered. I believe in God. Chapter 15. The Will of Heaven. In the chamber of justice of the communal palace sat that day not the assessors of the Ruota, but the counselors in their damask robes. The council attended the city of Piacenza, and to preside over them sat not their prior, but Ferrante Gonzaga himself, in a gown of scarlet velvet edged with miniver. They sat at a long table draped in red at the room's end, Gonzaga slightly above them on a raised dais, under a canopy. Behind him hung a golden shield upon which was figured, between two upright columns each surmounted by a crown, the double-headed black eagle of Austria. A scroll intertwining the pillars was charged with the motto Plus Ultra. At the back of the court stood the curious who had come to see the show, held in bounds by a steel line of Spanish halberdiers. But the concourse was slight, for the folk of Piacenza still had weightier matters to concern them than the trial of a wife-stealer. I had ridden in with an escort of 20 lances, but I left these in the square when I entered the palace, and formally made surrender to the officer who met me. This officer led me at once into the chamber of justice, 2 men-at-arms opening a lane for me through the people with the butts of their pikes, so that I came into the open space before my judges, and bowed profoundly to Gonzaga. Coldly he returned the salutation, his prominent eyes regarding me from out of that florid, crafty countenance. On my left, but high up the room, and immediately at right angles to the judges' tables, sat Galliado, full-armed. He was flanked on the one side by Fra Gervasio, who greeted me with a melancholy smile, and on the other by Falcone, who sat rigid. Opposite to this group, on the judge's other hand, stood Cosimo. He was flushed, and his eyes gleamed as they measured me with haughty triumph. From me they passed to Bianca, who followed after me with her women, pale, but intrepid and self-contained, her face the whiter by contrast with the mourning gown which she still wore for her father, and which it might well come to pass that she should continue hereafter to wear for me. I did not look at her again as she passed on and up towards Galliado, who had risen to receive her. He came some few steps to meet her, and escorted her to a seat next his own, so that Falcone moved down to another vacant stool. Her women found place behind her. An usher set a chair for me, and I, too, sat down, immediately facing the Emperor's lieutenant. Then another usher in a loud voice summoned Cosimo to appear and state his grievance. He advanced a step or two, when Gonzaga raised his hand, to sign to him to remain where he was, so that all could see him whilst he spoke. Forthwith, quickly, fluently, and lucidly, as if he got the thing by heart, Cosimo recited his accusation. How he had married Bianca de Cavalcante by her father's consent in her father's own castle of Pagliano. How that same night his palace in Piacenza had been violently invested by myself and others abetting me. And how he had carried off his bride and burned his palace to the ground. How I had since held her from him, shut up in the castle of Pagliano, which was his fief in his quality, as her husband, and how similarly I had unlawfully held Pagliano against him to his hurt. Finally, he reminded the court that it appealed to the Pope, who had issued a brief commanding me, under pain of excommunication and death, to make surrender, that I had flouted the pontifical authority, and that it was only upon his appeal to Caesar and upon the imperial mandate that I had surrendered. Wherefore he begged the court to uphold the Holy Father's authority, and forthwith to pronounce me excommunicate and my life forfeit, restoring to him his wife Bianca, and his domain of Pagliano, which he will hold as the emperor's liege and loyal servitor. Having spoken thus, he bowed to the court, stepped back, and sat down. The 10 looked at Gonzaga. Gonzaga looked at me. "Have you anything to say?" he asked. I rose, imbued by a calm that surprised me. "Messer Cosimo has left something out of his narrative," said I, "when he says that I violently invested his palace here in Piacenza on the night of his marriage, and dragged thence the Lady Bianca, others abetting me. He would do well to add in the interest of justice the names of those who were my abettors." Cosimo rose again. "Does it matter to this court and to the affair at issue what caitiffs he employed?" he asked haughtily. "If they were caitiffs, it would not matter," said I, "but they were not. Indeed, to say that it was I who invested his palace is to say too much. The leader of that expedition was Mona Bianca's own father, who, having discovered the truth of the nefarious traffic in which Messer Cosimo was engaged, hastened to rescue his daughter from an infamy." Cosimo shrugged. "These are mere words," he said. "The lady herself is present and can bear witness to their truth." I cried. "A prejudiced witness indeed," said Cosimo with confidence, and Gonzaga nodded, whereupon my heart sank. "Will Messer Agostino give us the names of any of the braves who were with him?" Quoth Cosimo, "It will no doubt assist the ends of justice, for those men should be standing by him now." He checked me no more than in time. I had been on the point of citing Falcone, and suddenly I perceived that to do so would be to ruin Falcone without helping myself. I looked at my cousin. "In that case," said I will not name them." Falcone, however, was minded to name himself, for with a grunt he made suddenly to rise. But Gelato stretched an arm across Bianca and forced the equerry back into his seat. Cosimo saw and smiled. He was very sure of himself by now. "The only witness whose word would carry weight will be the late Lord of Pagliano," he said, "and the prisoner is more crafty than honest in naming one who is dead. Your Excellency will know the precise importance attached to that." Again his Excellency nodded. Could it indeed be that I was enmeshed? My calm deserted me. "Will Messer Cosimo tell your Excellency under what circumstances the Lord of Pagliano died?" I cried. "It is yourself should be better able to inform the court of that," answered Cosimo quickly, "since he died at Pagliano after you had borne his daughter thither, as we have proof." Gonzaga looked at him sharply. "Are you implying, sir, that there is a further crime for which Messer Agostino d'Anguissa should be indicted?" he inquired. Cosimo shrugged and pursed his lips. "I will not go so far, since the matter of Ettore Cavalcanti's death does not immediately concern me. Besides, there is enough contained in the indictment as it stands." The imputation was none the less terrible, and could not fail in effect upon the minds of the 10. I was in despair, for at every question it seemed that the tide of destruction rose higher about me. I deemed myself irrevocably lost. The witnesses I might have called were as good as gagged. Yet there was one last question in my quiver, a question which I thought must crumple up his confidence. "Can you tell His Excellency where you were upon your marriage night?" I cried hoarsely, my temples throbbing. Superbly Cosimo looked round at the court. He shrugged and shook his head as if in utter pity. "I leave it to your Excellency to say where a man should be upon his marriage night," he said, with an astounding impudence, and there were some who tittered in the crowd behind me. "Let me again beg your Excellency and your worthinesses to pass the judgment, and so conclude this foolish comedy." Gonzaga nodded gravely, as if entirely approving, whilst with fat jeweled hand he stroked his ample chin. "I, too, think that it is time," he said, whereupon Cosimo, with a sigh of relief, would have resumed his seat, but that I stayed him with the last thing I had to say. "My lord," I cried, appealing to Gonzaga, "the true events of that night are set forth in a memorial which 2 copies were drawn up, one for the Pope and the other for your Excellency, as the Emperor's vicegerent. Shall I recite its contents, that Messer Cosimo may be examined upon them?" "It is not necessary," came Gonzaga's icy voice. "The memorial is here before me," and he tapped the document upon the table. Then he fixed his prominent eyes upon Cosimo. "You are aware of its contents?" he asked. Cosimo bowed, and Gelato moved at last, for the first time since the trial's inception. Until now he had sat like a carved image, save when he had thrust out a hand to restrain Falcone, and his attitude had filled me with an unspeakable dread. But at this moment he leaned forward, turning an ear towards Cosimo, as if anxious not to miss a single word that the man might utter. And Cosimo, intent as he was, did not observe the movement. "I saw its fellow at the Vatican," said my cousin, "and since the Pope in his wisdom and goodness judge worthless the witnesses whose signatures it bears, His Holiness thought well to issue the brief upon which your Excellency has acted in summoning Agostino d'Anguissola before you here. Thus is that memorial disposed of as a false and lying document. And yet," said Gonzaga thoughtfully, his heavy lip between thumb and forefinger, "it bears, amongst others, the signature of the Lord of Pagliano's confessor. Without violation of the seal of the confessional, it is impossible for that friar to testify," was the answer, "and the Holy Father cannot grant him dispensation for so much. His signature, therefore, stands for nothing." There followed a moment's silence. The 10 whispered among themselves, but Gonzaga never consulted them by so much as a glance. They appear to serve none but a decorative office in that court of his, for they bore no share in the dispensing of a justice of which he constituted himself the sole arbiter. At last the governor spoke. "It seems, indeed, that there is no more to say, and the court has a clear course before it, since the emperor cannot contravene the mandates of the Holy See. Nothing remains, then, but to deliver sentence, unless—" He paused, and his eyes singularly sly, his lips pursed almost humorously. He turned his glance upon Gelato. "Ser Cosimo," he said, "has pronounced this memorial a false and lying document. Is there anything that you, Messer Gelato, as its author, can have to tell the court?" Instantly the condottiero rose, his great scarred face very solemn, his eyes brooding. He advanced almost to the very center of the table, so that he all but stood immediately before Gonzaga, yet sideways, so that I had him in profile, whilst he fully faced Cosimo. Cosimo at least had ceased to smile. His handsome white face had lost some of its supercilious confidence. Here was something unexpected, something upon which he had not reckoned, against which he had not provided. "What has Ser Gelato to do with this?" he demanded harshly. "That, sir, no doubt he will tell us, if you will have patience," Gonzaga answered, so sweetly and deferentially that a certainty some of Cosimo's uneasiness must have been dissipated. I leaned forward now, scarce daring to draw breath, lest I should lose a word of what was to follow. The blood that had earlier surged in my face had now all receded again, and my pulses throbbed like hammers. Then Gelato spoke, his voice very calm and level. "Will your Excellency first permit me to see the papal brief upon which you acted in summoning hither the accused?" Silently Gonzaga delivered a parchment into Galeotto's hands. The condottiero studied it, frowning. Then he smote it sharply with his right hand. "This document is not in order," he announced. "How?" quoth Cosimo, and he smiled again, reassured completely by now, convinced that here was no more than a minor quibble of the law. "You are here described as Cosimo d'Anguissola, Lord of Mondolfo and Carmina. These titles are not yours." The blood stirred faintly in Cosimo's cheeks. "Those fiefs were conferred upon me by our late lord, Duke Pierluigi," he replied. Gonzaga spoke. "The confiscations effected by the late usurping duke, and the awards made out of such confiscations, have been cancelled by imperial decree. All lands so confiscated are by this decree revertible to their original holders upon their taking oath of allegiance to Caesar." Cosimo continued to smile. "This is no matter of confiscation effected by Duke Pierluigi," he said. "The confiscation and my own investiture in the confiscated fiefs are a consequence of Agostino d'Anguissola's recreancy. At least, it is in such terms that my investiture is expressly announced in the papal bull that has been granted me and in the brief which lies before your Excellency. Nor was such express announcement necessary, for since I was next heir after Ser Agostino to the tyranny of Mondolfo, it follows that upon his being outlawed and his life forfeit, I enter upon my succession. Here, thought I, were we finally checkmated." But Gelato showed no sign of defeat. "Where is this bull you speak of?" he demanded, as though he were the judge himself. Cosimo haughtily looked past him at Gonzaga. "Does your Excellency ask to see it?" "Assuredly," said Gonzaga shortly. "I may not take your word for its existence." Cosimo plucked a parchment from the breast of his brown satin doublet, unfolded it, and advanced to lay it before Gonzaga, so that he stood near Gelato, not more than an arm's length between them. The governor conned it, then passed it to Gelato. "It seems in order," he said. Nevertheless, Gelato studied a while. And then, still holding it, he looked at Cosimo, and the scarred face that hitherto had been so somber now wore a smile. "It is as irregular as the other," he said. "It is entirely worthless." "Worthless?" quoth Cosimo, in an amazement that was almost scornful. "But have I not already explained? It sets forth here, cutting Galato with assurance, that the fief of Mondolfo and Carmina are confiscated from Agostino d'Anguissola. Now I submit to your excellency and to your worthinesses," he added, turning aside, "that this confiscation is grotesque and impossible, since Mondolfo and Carmina never were the property of Agostino d'Anguissola, and can no more be taken from him than can a coat be taken from the back of a naked man, unless," he added, sneering, "a papal bull is capable of miracles." Cosimo stared at him with round eyes, and I stared too, no glimmer of the enormous truth breaking yet upon my bewildered mind. In the court the silence was deathly until Gonzaga spoke. "Do you say that Mondolfo and Carmina did not belong, that they never were the fiefs of Agostino d'Anguissola?" he asked. "That is what I say," returned Galato, towering there, immense and formidable in his gleaming armor. "To whom, then, did they belong?" "They did and do belong to Giovanni d'Anguissola, Agostino's father." Cosimo shrugged at this, and some of the dismay passed from his countenance. "What folly is this?" he cried. "Giovanni d'Anguissola died at Perugia 8 years ago. That is what is generally believed, and what Giovanni d'Anguissola has left all to believe, even to his own priest-ridden wife, even to his own son. Sitting there, lest had the world known the truth whilst Pier Luigi lived, such a confiscation as this should, indeed, have been perpetrated. But he did not die at Perugia. At Perugia, Ser Cosimo, he took this scar which for 13 years has served him for a mask." And he pointed to his own face. I came to my feet, scarce believing what I heard. Galato was Giovanni d'Anguissola, my father, and my heart had never told me so. In a flash I saw things that hitherto had been obscure, things that should have guided me to the truth had I but heeded their indications. How? For instance, had I assumed that the Anguissola whom he had mentioned as one of the heads of the conspiracy against Pier Luigi could have been myself. I stood swaying there, whilst his voice boomed out again. "Now that I have sworn fealty to the Emperor in my true name, upon the hands of my Lord Gonzaga here, now that the imperial aegis protects me from Pope and Pope's bastards, now that I have accomplished my life's work, and broken the pontifical sway in this Piacenza, I can stand forth again and resume the state that is my own. There stands my foster brother, who has borne witness to my true identity. There Falcone, who has been my equerry these 30 years. And there are the brothers Pallavicini, who tended me and sheltered me when I lay at the point of death from the wounds that disfigured me at Perugia. So, my Lord Cosimo, ere you can proceed further in this matter against my son, you will need to take your brief and your bull back to Rome and get them amended, for there is in Italy no lord of Mondolfo and Carmina other than myself." Cosimo fell back before him limp and trembling, his spirit broken by this shattering blow. And then Gonzaga uttered words that might have heartened him. But after being hurled from what he accounted the pinnacle of success, he mistrusted now the crafty lieutenant, saw that he had been played with as a mouse by this imperial cat with a soft, deadly paws. "We might waive the formalities in the interest of justice," purred the lieutenant. "There is this memorial, my lord," he said, and tapped the document, his eyes upon my father. "Since your excellency wishes the matter to be disposed of out of hand, it can, I think, be done," he said, and he looked again at Cosimo. "You have said that this memorial is false, because the witnesses whose names are here cannot be admitted to testify." Cosimo braced himself for a last effort. "Do you defy the Pope?" he thundered. "If necessary," was the answer. "I have done so all my life." Cosimo turned to Gonzaga. "It is not I who have branded this memorial false," he said, "but the Holy Father himself. The Emperor," said my father, "may opine that in this matter the Holy Father has been deluded by liars. There are other witnesses. There is myself, for one. This memorial contains nothing but what was imparted to me by the Lord of Pagliano on his deathbed, in the presence of his confessor. We cannot admit the confessor." Gonzaga thrust in. "Give me leave, your excellency." It was not in his quality as confessor that Fra Gervasio heard the dying man depone. Cavalcana's confession followed upon that, and there was in addition present the seneschal of Pagliano, who is present here, sufficient to establish this memorial alike before the imperial and the pontifical courts. And I swear to God, as I stand here in his sight," he continued in a ringing voice, "that every word there set down is spoken by Ettore Cavalcanti, Lord of Pagliano, some hours before he died, and so will those others swear. And I charge your excellency, as Caesar's vicegerent, to accept that memorial as an indictment of that caitiff Cosimo d'Anguissola, who lent himself to so foul and sacrilegious a deed, for it involved the defilement of the sacrament of marriage. In that you lie," screamed Cosimo, crimson now with rage, the veins in his throat and brow swelling like ropes. A silence followed. My father turned to Falcone and held out his hand. Falcone sprang to give him a heavy iron gauntlet. Holding this by the fingers, my father took a step towards Cosimo, and he was smiling, very calm again after his late furious mood. "Be it so," he said. "Since you say that I lie, I do here challenge you to prove it upon my body." And he crashed the iron glove straight into Cosimo's face, so that the skin was broken and blood flowed about the mouth, leaving the lower half of the visage crimson, the upper dead white. Gonzaga sat on, entirely unmoved, and waited, indifferent to the stir there was amid the ten. For by the ancient laws of chivalry, however much they might be falling now into desuetude, if Cosimo took up the glove, the matter passed beyond the jurisdiction of the court, and all men must abide by the issue of the trial by battle. For a long moment Cosimo hesitated. Then he saw ruin all about him. He, who had come to this court so confidently, had walked into a trap. He saw it now, and saw that the only loophole was the chance this combat offered him. He played the man in the end. He stooped and took up the glove. "Upon your body, then, God helping me," he said. Unable longer to control myself, I sprang to my father's side. I caught his arm. "Let me? Father, let me?" He looked into my face and smiled, and the steel-colored eyes seemed moist and singularly soft. "My son," he said, and his voice was gentle and soothing as a woman's caress. "My father," I answered him, a knot in my throat. "Alas, that I must deny you the first thing you asked me by that name," he said. "But the challenge is given and accepted. Do you take Bianca to the Duomo, and pray that right may be done and God's will prevail. Gervasio shall go with you." And then came an interruption from Gonzaga. "My lord," he said, "will you determine when and where this battle is to be fought?" "Upon the instant," answered my father. "On the banks of Po with a score of lances to keep the lists." Gonzaga looked at Cosimo. "Do you agree to this?" "It cannot be too soon for me," replied the quivering Cosimo, black hatred in his glance. "Be it so, then," said the governor, and he rose, the court rising with him. My father pressed my hand again. "To the Duomo, Agostino, till I come," he said, and on that we parted. My sword was returned to me by Gonzaga's orders. In so far as it concerned myself, the trial was at an end, and I was free. At Gonzaga's invitation, very gladly I there, and then swore fealty to the emperor upon his hands. And then, with Bianca and Gervasio, I made my way through the cheering crowd and came out into the sunshine, where my lances, who had already heard the news, set up a great shout at sight of me. Thus we crossed the square and went to the Duomo to render thanks. We knelt at the altar rail, and Gervasio knelt above us upon the altar's lowest step. Somewhere behind us knelt Bianca's women, who had followed us to the church. Thus we waited for close upon 2 hours that were as an eternity. And kneeling there, the eyes of my soul conned closely the scroll of my young life as it had been unfolded hitherto. I reviewed its beginnings in the grayness of Mondolfo, under the tutelage of my poor, dolorous mother who had striven so fiercely to set my feet upon the ways of sanctity. But my ways had been errant ways, even though myself I had sought to walk as she directed. I had strayed and blundered, veered and veered again, a very mockery of what she strove to make me, a strolling saint, indeed, as Cosimo had dubbed me, a wandering mummer when I sought after holiness. But my strolling, my errantry ended here at last at the steps of this altar, as I knew. Deeply had I sinned, but deeply and strenuously had I expiated. And the heaviest burden of my expiation had been that endured in the past year at Pagliano beside my gentle Bianca, who was another's wedded wife, that cross of penitence, so singularly condigned to my sin, I had borne with fortitude, heartened by the confidence that thus should I win the pardon, and that the burden would be mercifully lifted when the expiation was complete. In the lifting of that burden from me, I should see a sign that pardon was mine at last, that at last I was accounted worthy of this pure maid through whom I should have won the grace, through whom I had come to learn that love, God's greatest gift, is the great sanctifier of man. That the stroke of that ardently awaited hour was even now impending, I did not for a moment doubt. Behind us, the door opened and steps clanked upon the granite floor. Fra Gervasio rose very tall and gaunt, his gaze anxious. He looked, and anxiety passed. Thankfulness overspread his face. He smiled serenely, tears in his deep-set eyes. Seeing this, I, too, dared to look at last. Up the aisle came my father, very erect and solemn, and behind him followed Falcone with eyes a-twinkle in his weather-beaten face. "Let the will of heaven be done," said my father. And Gervasio came down, pronounced the nuptial blessing over us.